Today is our first discussion on areas of consciousness, including states of consciousness and how those states can actually be altered. We are going to include a little bit about information about the conscious and unconscious, sleep, as well as a little bit of information about drugs. We are going to deal with another section in a later lecture. One question we can ask ourselves is simply, what is consciousness? And quite frankly, that's probably a discussion more for the philosophers, but this idea is something that we really still should be thinking about. This definition, sentience or awareness of internal or external existence, is one of many definitions. There really isn't the best definition out there, but this is as good as any. The actual concept of stuff like consciousness and specifically sentience is discussed pretty much everywhere in philosophy, in science fiction. Anybody who's ever watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, there's an episode in the second season, Measure of Man, where they actually discuss whether Lieutenant Commander Data is sentient, basically a sentient creature, or if he's simply a machine and just really basically a piece of very advanced Starfleet property. They actually have a little trial where this information is discussed. It's a very philosophical episode. In that one, they decide sentience has three parts: intelligence, self-awareness, and consciousness. They do eventually rule in favor of Commander Data, because he seems to have an awful lot of this. But this is a question that we can continue to debate ad nauseum. Quite frankly, this has already been debated ad nauseum, honestly. This is a quote here from basically the father of modern medicine. He lived thousands of years ago, and he was asking this question, or at least trying to answer this question. So men ought to know that from the brain, and from the brain only, arise our pleasures, joys, laughter, and jests, as well as our sorrows, pains, griefs, and tears. Through it, in particular, we think, see, hear, distinguish the ugly from the beautiful, the bad from the good, and the pleasant from the unpleasant. This here was partially written in response to this whole discussion about what is this whole concept of consciousness. And some of this should sound very familiar. In that other slide, they were talking about internal states, external states. We have a little bit of that here. Certainly, this is at the very least, some self-awareness and ways to really distinguish, and how that brain does create what's really going on here, and how it creates things. That's what consciousness basically comes down to with him. Of course, that's all well and good, but people are really seriously discussing this forever. It's still being discussed. It's philosophy, psychology. We could discuss this ad nauseum. The most famous philosopher really was Descartes with his "I think, therefore I am." So basically, I think, therefore I'm conscious, therefore I must be. So, as we were briefly mentioned, Descartes. Does anybody know the joke about Descartes' death? So, here's your joke of the day. Great French philosopher René Descartes is most famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." He made this certainty the starting point of his entire philosophy. What is less known is that he died in a rather unusual circumstance. He was sitting in a cafe one day when a waiter approached him, coffee pot in hand. "Would you like some coffee, monsieur?" asked the waiter. "I think not," Descartes replied, and poof, he disappeared. Okay, that's not really how he did it, but that's how it works for the joke. As we're discussing parts of consciousness, I briefly mentioned self-awareness. Well, there actually are two levels of awareness, whether it's self-awareness or not. And this first one is low level of awareness. There are several situations where there is a low level of awareness. I'm not so sure I agree with some of this, like death. Death is low awareness. Well, I would say death is probably no awareness, but that's what they officially have it down as. All right. People may be aware of what a coma is. Well, coma is a very interesting state. I can see how that could be argued for low awareness. But I do have a little bit of a story, because if you ever go to the ICU, most of y'all probably never been in one, you'll see these people that are kind of like, lying down there in a coma. And they're may not be responsive to verbal stimuli, painful stimuli. They may be completely unresponsive. However, that really doesn't mean that they're not somewhat aware. Maybe they just can't, something else is up and they just can't move. There have been a few cases where a person was, in a coma or persistent vegetative state. As far as they were concerned, this person there is no awareness left. And there was at least, well, there have been several situations, but I happen to remember one of them. There was this guy, and I can't remember what happened, but he was in some type of horrible situation, and he was put into a, persistent vegetative state. They thought he was pretty much unaware of anything that was going on. They said he's gone. Well, a few years later, somehow he recovered, and turns out he was very much, even during his coma and persistent state, he was quite aware of what was going on. He remembered his mother at one point coming up to him when he was in the wheelchair, or in a coma or whatever he was in that particular moment, and told him he wished he died because he was so much of a burden. He remembered that. And she was later horrified that he remembered that. But I know every time I go into an ICU and deal with people that are in comas, I do remember that story and other stories that are somewhat similar. People kind of make fun of me, but when I go into a room like that with a patient, I won't say anything in that situation that I wouldn't say to them when alive, because of stuff like this. I don't know if they really truly have no awareness, or if they do, if they can hear everything. I just tend to think it's best that I step away, and if I have something possibly troubling to say, I won't do it in their area. A lot of the nurses have made fun of me. I don't care. I then pass on some of these stories, like that story I just mentioned, and some of them have agreed maybe it's not a bad idea to do that, because it very well could be that they're in low awareness. I just pretend that they're sleeping and can awaken at any time. Sleeping, various levels of sleep. There are several levels. Some of them you're more aware than others. Like stage 1, pretty easy to awaken you. But you are still aware, just you're not super aware. There's also this concept of daydreaming. Daydreaming, you do have awareness. Maybe someone can snap you out of your daydream generally. But for the most part, you're in your own little world. Lots of things can be coming in. And then there's this whole concept of non-conscious processing as well. And that concept is basically that all these message units because we're always surrounded by message units basically all the time, they're all coming in, and it's coming in under the level of perception, which, realistically, some of these things all, with the exception of death, good almighty, that they're all similar things. A lot of things will be coming in, and maybe you're not paying attention to them, maybe you're not filtering it. Things are there, they're just maybe not always easy to act on. But this non-conscious processing is any time something comes in, and you're not really, you're not filtering it out. It's all just getting in and getting into your subconscious. And we're going to actually come back a little bit to that in a second. We also have stuff like higher awareness. It's when your decision making is going on. While there might be a lot of things coming into your system, you're really only focusing on a few dozen things. If you're working on the decision making, you're mostly focused, hopefully, on that decision. Concept of mindfulness. I'm not an expert on mindfulness. I don't pretend to be an expert on mindfulness, but I do know that it can help people with anxiety. Some of the concepts of mindfulness is maybe you're first focusing on 5 things, then 4, 3, 2, and eventually, hopefully, if all goes well, you're only thinking about one thing and your anxiety has mostly dissipated. High awareness is also inclusive of problem solving, because when you're focused on a problem, that should be your primary thing. Most of the other things you're just not really paying any attention to. Going back a little bit to this whole thing about non-conscious processing, that's really when everything comes in, again, under the level of awareness. There are some very famous subtypes of non-conscious processing. One of them includes priming. Priming is an interesting situation, but I'll give you some examples about what we mean by priming. But first of all, priming is basically exposure to one thing can later alter a behavior or thought of something else. That's basically the idea of it. And if you ever do a study, it's going to be hard. They're going to really scrutinize you on this, because so many things don't reproduce very well. I'll just put it up there. They're very scrutinized because of reproducibility issues. There have been some famous studies that involved priming. One of them was got a bunch of people, they listened to certain music, and people who listened to one group left the laboratory more slowly. Okay, that was one idea. There was another one where they listened to When I'm 64. Some people then started forgetting their age. They're saying that this is a priming issue. There have also been other situations that don't involve music. So if you look at this little word search thing here that you have, you'll notice that a whole bunch of these words are kind of like rude words. Actually, they are. Rude's even one of them. Well, something like this was also used in another priming study. Basically, what they did is they took these people, they put them in a room because they were supposed to wait for the experimenter, but it was they put them in this desk, in this little office with a little desk, and gave them something to do. Some people had these these word searches that had kind of like rude-ish behaviors listed that they had to find, and another group had kind of neutral areas. So what they were really trying to do is after they let them in there for a few minutes, hopefully they do the puzzle, is they were then really counting how many times the subjects would basically interrupt the interviewer. They were doing it for like 10 minutes. And in that case, 60% of the people who did the rude words interrupted them, and only 40% of the normal control group interrupted the interviewer. So that's another example of priming. So the idea is that these words prime them to kind of be ruder. There's also this thing about subliminal cues. Probably people have heard of this. There was a very famous situation that the published study that it did turn out later to be false, but people still discuss it, where this person claimed that by putting in subliminal advertising in movie theaters, they were able to increase the sale of Coca-Cola, increase popcorn. Well, okay, well, it turned out the thing was false, but the idea is that everything was basically coming in, and it was basically being affected for any of that. That ended up being completely false. That doesn't stop people from trying to do subliminal advertising. I would suggest going onto YouTube and doing a search for subliminal advertising. There is a lot of it out there, but because I do tend to have students that tend to be underage, I don't really want to show some of that because a lot of it does involve sexual relations. There was a few different groups that apparently had somebody performing fellatio in their ad or something like that. I'm not really sure. Didn't want to expose that to anybody. Just be aware they're out there. For those of you who are really bored, go look for it on YouTube. But yeah, the whole concept is below the threshold of conscious awareness, and well, God only knows what some of those advertisings are supposed to be. Now we bring you to something that is a little controversial, this implicit association test. Basically, what it's trying to do is measure that implicit any implicit biases you may have. And the thing here is that, as I mentioned with this whole low conscious of awareness, a whole bunch of stuff is coming in. You're not really filtering things out that well. And let's face it, a lot of message units come in that, well, honestly, are not always the most helpful and most kind, shall we say. Like, for example, the majority of racism in America is not the most overt. I mean, we've come a very long way for decades, but there are still things out there, and some of those message units do get in. Not that there aren't that many people. Well, yeah. I was about to get very political right there, but I'm not going to go there. But there are a lot of people who do spout out the hateful stuff. Most stuff just isn't present, or not very noticeable. It is going, beneath that level of perception for the most part. This thing is trying to, well, help assess that, see what your implicit biases might be. And if you ever go to something like Medical College of Georgia a few years ago, they were making everybody take a couple of these tests to see maybe if you were a little bit biased towards one race or another, or women or another, basically to see, to make you aware of your own issues so that hopefully you can work on it. I do have a YouTube video on the next slide, which will do this a little bit better than I can explain. Certainly, they also have an example, so we're just going to do that.
Time to discuss the implicit association test, the IAT, which is now the most popular tool for measuring implicit bias. Just to be clear, the test itself, a reaction time measure, isn't the same thing as the underlying construct, implicit bias. It's just a quick and dirty measurement device. The best way to understand the IAT is to take a test yourself, which you can do easily and anonymously at Project Implicit. For now, I'll offer a quick synopsis. Understanding the IAT, and indeed all reaction time measures, begins with a basic insight. It's always easier for our brains to sort two concepts together if they are closely associated in our minds. For example, if I say the word dog and ask you to complete this word, you'll be quicker to think cat than bat. Or if I say the word doctor, you will be quicker to think nurse than purse. Armed with this insight, scientists created the IAT, which measures how quickly we sort various pictures and words flash on a computer screen together. Our sorting speed reflects how tightly we associate any two concepts. Quicker sorting means stronger association. The black-white race attitude test, for example, compares implicit attitudes toward two racial categories, black folks and white folks. Each racial category is represented by cropped photos of male faces. To begin, you're asked to sort the faces as quickly as possible. If you see a white face, hit a key to your left. If you see a black face, hit a key to your right. Next, you sort words that represent two attitudinal categories, good and bad. When you see a good word such as beauty, hit a key to your left. When you see a bad word such as filth, hit a key to your right. Now the real challenge starts. You're instructed to sort both photos and words, whatever flashes on the screen. For some runs, you are instructed to press the same key for white faces and good words, say on your left, and a different same key for black faces and bad words, say on your right. If you have a more positive association with white folks as compared to black folks, then in this particular arrangement, you will find your groove and fly through the test. Most of us do. But on other runs, which are randomized and counterbalanced, the IAT will give you different directions. Press the same key for white faces and bad words, and another same key for black faces and good words. In these runs, most players can't quite get into a groove, take longer to respond, and make more mistakes by hitting the wrong key. The average time differential between the two arrangements, white plus good as compared to black plus good, is called the Iat Effect and reflects the strength of an attitude. On average, we might be a fraction of a second faster pairing white faces with good words than black faces with good words. This means that on average, we have an implicit preference for whites. Over nearly 2 decades, millions of people have taken implicit association tests hosted by Project Implicit. These tests have measured everything from racial attitudes to gender associations to preferences for one political candidate over another. The results are overwhelming. Implicit biases, measured by reaction times, are systematic and pervasive. They are statistically significant, which means they are not due to chance. On average, our implicit attitudes, which, to remind you, are overall valences toward a category, predictably favor certain groups over others. 80% of participants prefer young over old, 69% thin over overweight, 68% white over black, 76% able-bodied over disabled. Our implicit stereotypes, which are specific trait associations, are also predictable. 72% of participants associate blacks with weapons as opposed to harmless objects. 61% associate Asians with the foreign as opposed to American. 72% associate women with humanities as opposed to math. 76% associate women with family as opposed to career. Pervasiveness does not mean that every single person has the exact same amount of bias. There's wide variability across individuals and groups. For instance, most whites have an implicit preference for whites over blacks, but African Americans show no preference on average. But there's a natural bell curve around that zero average, with about a third of African Americans also showing an implicit attitude in favor of whites over blacks. Unfortunately, no one is immune. But this doesn't mean that we're powerless. To learn more, watch my final video in this series, Lesson 6, Countermeasures.
Moving on from this low levels of awareness, let's move a little bit onto the higher levels of awareness. I want you to think about what times of the day or week, whatever, where you feel most focused, which basically would be the highest level of your awareness. And you may also want to ask why you may feel that way or think that that's the most focused time. Hopefully the reason I asked you that question about what's the most focused time, that might be the best time for you to do stuff like, problem solving. Because these levels of awareness really do tend to do best on that. At that, these are times where you can focus on just a handful of things and hopefully do a good job. So you might want to take harder courses when you can focus a little bit better. But these levels of awareness really, the high levels of awareness anyway, are characterized about this ability to focus attention. If you see this image, you really can't make out a whole lot of it. While there's certainly everything there, you can only really make out this one word right here, this nach. I think there are other little like German words, but I can't really tell because it's out of focus. In this case, we're really only focusing on that one word. That's basically what happens with these higher levels of awareness. You're really only focusing on just a few things of all the thousands of things that do come into your system. Mindfulness, not an expert on mindfulness, but that does focus. That does relate to this levels of awareness, focusing on only, hopefully getting down to focusing on only a few things. Decision making. When you're trying to make a decision, you really hopefully shouldn't have a whole lot of things going on. You do need to focus just on that particular situation, because if you get too much other information and you're just too distracted, you may make a less than ideal decision. Same with problem solving. If you're only focusing in on a few things, you probably will do better at problem solving than, well, if you have a million things going on. Focusing just on the problem at hand, make it much more efficient, at least hopefully. These different levels of awareness, they all have their costs and their benefits, to be quite honest with you. So low levels of awareness is that's when everything is coming in. A million message units could be coming in, and because you're not really paying attention to all of that, you may be influenced by very, very subtle things. Like, as mentioned, racism is around. Most of it's coming in at very low levels of awareness to most people. So that could make you influenced or not, be influenced or not. Now, the benefit of this low awareness is that it saves so much mental effort. Imagine what would happen if you had to analyze every bit of information. Now, think about it this way. Some of y'all are wearing shoes, socks, whatever. Imagine if you constantly felt every single thing that was going on there. You probably didn't even think about your shoes until I mentioned it, because your brain realistically is tuning it out. It's not going to worry about the mental effort in that situation. So it's really saving you a hell of a lot of energy. Now, if you're looking at something that's requiring higher awareness of these thousands of whatever message units coming in, you're using mental effort to only pay attention to a few of them, hopefully, or at least spending most of your energy on that. That doesn't mean other things aren't coming in. They very well could be, but you're mostly focusing on only a few. Now, if you are able to take this energy, you can certainly go through and use this to overcome some biases you may already have. When MCG had us all do that test, well, now we're aware of what we can work on and be very, very careful about how to approach some patients or not. Now, as we mentioned, those states of consciousness, we also have different states of awareness: sleep, drugs, and hypnosis. Hypnosis will be covered in a different lecture because that's one of my research areas. Sleep. Quite frankly, my poor husband has really relates to this because he constantly tries to wake me up, and I'm not a morning person. Don't wake me up. And I always tell him that he's being mean to me when he wakes me up. So yes, it hurts when someone you love says something says mean things like it's time to wake up. So when we're thinking about sleep, most people think about this whole concept of downtime with, well, most people requiring about 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. However, not everybody does require that 7 to 9 hours. Albert Einstein required 10, or else he just wasn't himself. And I know relatives in my own family, one of my grandmothers, was quite happy with just 3 to 4, and she did that for, basically her entire lifetime. And everybody likes saying, well, if you're deviating too much from 7 to 9 hours of sleep, there has to be something wrong with you. And, I mean, it's possible that there is. However, you really have to look about what's normal for that person. Since there are people that, do fall out that norm, and if somebody says, oh, well, somebody sleeps too much, they're depressed, they very well might be, or maybe sleeping 10 hours is completely normal for them. It's just like when they say, oh, well, they're sleeping under a certain amount of time, maybe they're having a manic episode in bipolar. Well, maybe that's also their normal amount of time that they sleep. The more important thing, if you do something like this and try to think about pathologize somebody based on their sleep, you might want to actually be more concerned about changes in sleeping habits rather than how much they're actually sleeping. If somebody's going from 5 hours to 9, that's probably a bigger problem than, just sleeping 5-6 hours a night. Sleep in and of itself does have a little bit of control with the brainstem, but a whole lot of it does relate to the hypothalamus. It's a little tiny little part of the brain where, we also produce stuff like melatonin is out in that area. Melatonin can, help put you to sleep. If you're taking stuff over the counter, do be aware that you probably shouldn't take it every day unless a doctor tells you that it's okay to do so. There are also lots of sleep disorders, including insomnia, which isn't quite what everybody thinks it is. Not being able to sleep one night is probably not insomnia. You do have to have difficulty sleeping several times in a week, for like a month before you can actually get that diagnosis of insomnia. You also have stuff like sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, if you know anybody who snores, well, that's usually a warning sign of this. What's actually going on is, for whatever, there's actually 2 types of sleep apnea, but I'm not going to have this discussion as to what everything is. But there are a few different types of sleep apnea. Basically, what's happening is, for whatever reason, somebody is not really breathing as they should when they're asleep. Sometimes there's something blocking it, sometimes it's just whatever, something else is going on, and they wake up, not really feeling very well. And some key factors in it, usually snoring. You could, there's seems to be a genetic component as well. Being overweight, all those are things. You can actually help fix it by forcing oxygen in through a CPAP machine. A lot of people don't like that. But sleep apnea can not only destroy the sufferer's life because they're getting crappy sleep, they're waking up, and because they're waking up because they can't breathe, but heaven help you if you have somebody else in your bed, in your room, because if they're very sensitive to breathing patterns, they may notice that you're having issues, and that might wake them up. So you're affecting more than just yourself on not getting sleep apnea treated. There's also this, another one, narcolepsy. It's not uncommon. There are several different ways this can present. Somebody could literally come, walk in and just overwhelmingly need to go to sleep. Take a few minute power nap and they're fine. It also could show up in micro sleeps where it's like seconds, nobody knows they were even asleep. One of my friends, super klutzy, at least that's what we thought. Turns out she actually had some form of narcolepsy. There's also stuff like circadian rhythm disorders. There's various forms like this. Here's a few things that are listed in that. There's stuff like jet lag. A lot of people know what that is. You go to another country on vacation. You're a few hours off. Your body says it's time to go to sleep when it's really time to wake up. When I went to Israel. Israel is like 7 hours difference. So I was actually the only person who didn't have jet lag. Everybody else did. You also can get a kind of type of jet lag by dealing with shift work. You see this so much in healthcare. Maybe you're on night shift for like 3 days, you have a day off, then go on to day shift. This can be incredibly hard on the body, especially if you have those changing shifts like that. It's also, make it challenging to just get the sleep you need, and even do, regular errands, depending on what day, you're on. You also have stuff like delayed phase disorder. That basically is a situation where you're the sufferer, and I actually do have this disorder, where this person, instead, let's say 11 o'clock is the normal time most people go to bed. I don't even know what time normal people go to bed. Well, somebody with this is shifted several hours later. They might only start getting tired like at 2 a.m. and may not go to bed until 4 or 6 even. I've had days like that too. And these people will eventually go to sleep and will wake up maybe mid to late morning or early afternoon. And that's just the way their cycle is set up. American culture doesn't really love people with this disorder. American culture does, on the other hand, not mind people with advanced sleep phase disorder, which basically in that situation, well, just like the delayed people were going to bed a little bit too late, these guys are going to bed a little bit too early. They might, let's say they get off work at 5, they might be asleep at 6 or 7. I did know somebody with that disorder as well. And he would get up bright and early at 5 a.m. or whatever it is and just go to work. So, sometimes even earlier than 5 a.m. and he would always be so bright and chipper. And American culture really does like this because it means you're going to get to work early, going to work your whole time, you're going to be awake and alert, and you're going to go home. Unfortunately, this can take a toll on your family. If you have little kids, if you're going to bed, if you're getting home at 5 and going to bed at 7, well, you might not have a lot of quality time with them. So that is another situation. I actually have had somebody with that disorder in my family as well. There are a lot of other sleep disorders. I'm going to be showing you a YouTube video with a few more entertaining sleep disorders as well, and you can, just sit back and listen to them.
Hi, I'm Dr. Raj, and for those who don't know, I am a sleep doctor at the University of Southern California. Patients always come up to me and say, Dr. Raj, what are some of the craziest, strangest sleep stories that you know and patients that you have seen? So I came up with Dr. Raj's top 6 strange and odd sleep disorders that I will share with you today. Number 1, Klein-Levin syndrome, also known as Sleeping Beauty syndrome. You know what? I don't mind getting a couple of extra hours of sleep a night, but can you imagine getting 22, 23 hours of sleep every night for weeks? That is horrendous. And finally, when you're awake, you're not even yourself. You're a zombie. These patients are eating a lot, compulsive behavior disorders. There's even some hypersexuality. There's a strong association with bipolar disorder, and one of the only therapies for it is lithium. Number 5, sleep paralysis. That already sounds scary. Can you imagine waking up from your sleep and not being able to move? We have 2 main stages of sleep, REM and non-REM. And in REM sleep, we dream. But thank God, our bodies don't move just to protect ourselves. There are patients that wake up in this REM sleep paralyzed. And it is scary. In fact, there are sensations of seeing things in the room, a sensation of people sitting on their chest. And in fact, it is the sleep paralysis that's the mystery behind alien abduction. Number 4, Rem Movement Disorder. This is going to be the opposite of what we just talked about, sleep paralysis. We need to be paralyzed in REM sleep so we don't hurt ourselves and our bed partners. But in this disorder, my patients are kicking and punching during their dreams. They're reenacting them, dreams of chasing and stabbing and kicking. You can imagine how scary this can be for the bed partner and a danger to the patient. It's also associated with many neurological diseases such as dementia. Number 3, sleep groaning, also known as cataphrenia. So this is no laughing matter. This can be easily confused with sleep apnea, which you shouldn't. When we talk about sleep groaning, the groaning happens when you're blowing out during expiration, not to be confused with snoring that happens when you're breathing in. We're nearing the end of our countdown. Number 2, exploding head syndrome. Wow. Good thing is, no one's head is going to explode. But you're going to hear a loud gunshot, you're going to hear a loud chandelier, you're going to hear big noises as you're falling asleep. There are no headaches, there's no neurological consequences in the morning. It's all you need is reassurance. But what is the dangerous part about this? Patients get scared to fall asleep because of these noises. So remember, exploding head syndrome at number 2. Finally, number 1 on the countdown, familial fatal insomnia. People always ask, Dr. Raj, can you actually die from not falling asleep? I guess based upon this syndrome, the answer is yes. One thing you know, you're not falling asleep for a day, and next thing you know, you haven't slept for months and not getting to the refreshing states of sleep. People with this disorder have tried taking sleeping aids that made the disease worse. Thank God this is a rare disease, and very few people have actually died from it. I'm Dr. Raj, educating you today for a better outcome tomorrow.
As we are about to discuss a little bit more about sleep, it helps to know a little bit about, well, the brain waves, because we're going to find out that that actually helps with, knowing what stage of sleep you're in. So this is actually going kind of upside down. Normally they start with gamma or beta and then go down. This is a little bit different. But here we have delta, which 0.5 to 4 hertz. They're super slow wave sleep brain waves. You're going to see these in the very, very deepest levels of sleep. Theta at 5 to 8, you're also going to see this in sleep. Alpha, 8 to 12 hertz. Theta is still in sleep. Alpha is, you're at least very relaxed. You may be in sleep, you may not be in sleep. Beta. Beta is really where we're spending the majority of our waking time. That runs 18 to 30 hertz, roughly. There's also a level, honestly, you don't hear very, very frequently, but there is also gamma at 30 to 50 hertz. Gamma comes into play in a different altered state. When I mentioned the brain waves, so realistically, so I could talk about this thing here. If we're looking at the EEGs that are produced during sleep, you can see there's all sorts of things that are going on here. With awake, this blue near the top, you're mostly going to look at those beta waves as well as some alpha waves. So fairly quick. When you go to stage 1, you're just starting to fall asleep. You can usually be fairly easily awakened from time to time. If they want you, it's pretty easy to wake up. This is when you are transitioning into theta waves, so you're starting to slow down. Stage 2 sleep well, you see other things that start to form. Some of these things include the sleep spindles, which are labeled really well in this diagram. This short, basically burst of activity. And you also see this K complex, which is not labeled, but it's that big, you see that big spike to the top and then crash. Well, that's basically a K complex. For those of you who are taking the MCAT or the Psych GRE, periodically discussions about sleep do come up, and it is, I think it's usually about stage 2, like the characteristics of it. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's what it was. When you look down, you'll see stage 3 and 4. Well, some places still call it stage 3 and 4, and others just say, no, we kind of merged those stages together. And the difference between 3 and 4 is, well, basically what percentage of the waves are delta waves, which again are very, very slow. But in this wave is when it starts to move into so if you see delta waves, that's when it has at least started to move into that stage 3. And I believe stage 4 was had to be over 50% of people in delta. Really? Like I said, it doesn't really matter. You can just merge it into one. Now, coming down, you see there's that whole bunch of red. You see that's actually Rem sleep. If you look at that in comparison to all of these other ones, you may notice that it looks an awful lot like the awake and relaxed, or the awake or relaxed state. It's got an awful lot more energy, and you can even in this thing also see where the eyes are moving. The eyes are not necessarily not always detected by EEG, but you see these bursts, but they also are usually measuring things around the eyes. So yes, they can actually state that is probably their eyes moving. So we do have these things. If you estimate how long it takes you to go through all of these stages, and realistically you do go through all of these stages, it'll take about 90-ish minutes to go from stage 1 to the end of REM and restart the cycle. So if you're only getting 6 hours of sleep, you're probably going to be going around it roughly 4 times. If you have a lack of sleep, and sleep deprivation is incredibly common, especially in certain jobs, you can get a whole bunch of factors. You can be, much more easy to annoy. My husband will confirm 100%. It's like, don't bother me when I'm sleeping, because he wants to let sleeping Melvins lie. But because I just get that annoyed. It also can affect your reaction time. I've seen some studies where it said basically, sleep deprivation actually is about as dangerous as driving drunk as far as your reaction time goes. You also could have issues maintaining your focus, messing with your decision-making skills, and even potentially problems with your memory. How to improve your sleep hygiene? It's very quick. I feel like I'm obligated to say this. Limit your daytime naps. Try to avoid stimulants before bed. When I worked at one of the hospitals, the doctor said, don't take stimulants after 4. For people who were having issues sleeping, then he'd say none after 2 if things didn't work out. Exercise as best as you can. Have a regular bedtime routine. Even exposure to natural light and avoiding artificial light can help. There's a great book out there called At Day's Close, which actually discusses how artificial light has basically screwed up kind of our sleep schedule. It's a great book. Also, another thing is to keep non-sleep related activities out of the bedroom. And I probably slipped and said sexual because, quite frankly, when I was working at one of the hospitals, it was really always entertaining to watch this very nice guy talked to these very prim, proper Southerners, saying the only things that should be allowed in the bedroom is basically sleep and sex. Everything else, like computers, outside. So those are at least a few ways of how to improve your sleep hygiene. And now we're going to transition a little bit from sleep to drugs. And this sounds really bad, but let's talk about drugs. So I just want you to think about this question. And you can pause this video, answer it, and see if you're right. This class of drug is the most widely abused drug class in the world. If you said stimulants, or since we're playing Jeopardy, what are stimulants? You would be correct. These are any drug that speeds up the body and the brain and the nervous system. They have a lot of different ways that they work. Sometimes they're just blocking a reuptake. Sometimes they're just increasing neurotransmitters. There's a lot of ways they can work. There are just a lot of them out there. They're incredibly addictive. Some argue that they are basically the most addictive one out there as far as drug class, and are incredibly widespread. Pretty much most, if not all, cultures have something that relates to stimulants that they're using. You know, in the US, some people are basically giving caffeine to their babies in their bottles. It's a little bit bad. And it's just so widespread that if you do something like you don't drink coffee, I don't drink coffee, people look at you like you're some type of space alien. Because I'm supposed to not have any stimulants at all due to other issues I have. But some of these ideas of what's in this drug class includes caffeine, as I mentioned, nicotine, that can speed up the body. Then we can move on to things that are more, require a prescription. Ritalin, Adderall, they're both stimulants. And of course, there are the illegal substances, currently illegal substances, speed and cocaine. All of these do affect the brain a little bit differently. So if you ever wondered how, if there's any similarities between stuff like, all these, because most people are probably not thinking about caffeine and cocaine is being in the same drug class, but you'll notice if you ever see a caffeine overdose. Caffeine overdose and cocaine overdose can present very similarly. When I was in a situation, I didn't have a lot of caffeine at one point, then had a project I had to work on, ended up drinking a whole bunch, first of all, chewing a whole bunch of caffeinated gum, then drinking tea on top of that, having some chocolate, and all I did, I drank the equivalent of something like 6 cups of coffee in a 2-hour period. That was not a pleasant situation. I didn't sleep. I felt itchy and scratchy, as though something was trying to crawl out of my skin. And that was simply due to this huge amount of caffeine that was in my system. My husband wanted to take me to the ER. I said, they're not going to believe me. They're going to say I'm on cocaine, when really it's just a whole lot of caffeine. Not a pleasant experience. I do not recommend doing that. Another super common class is the depressants. Basically, just like the opposite of the stimulants, they slow down the body and the nervous system. Also, several mechanisms of action. They could increase GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, or directly interfere with pleasure centers in the brain. That'll do that too. Can be also fairly addictive, usually not nearly as widespread though, as far as easy to access. If you want to look at some of the drugs that meet this criteria, you're looking at alcohol, sleeping pills, and an awful lot of prescription medications, especially painkillers. Narcotics currently have a huge issue with painkiller addiction. Well, that's because it's, again, addictive, and they want to, of course, also kill the pain as well. But that's why we have, part of the reason we have this crazy crisis. There's also heroin. That is also, technically a narcotic as well. Another fairly widespread class is this hallucinogen that produces hallucinations. Realistically, the most famous probably is LSD, which, by the way, was discovered kind of by accident, just so you know. And it also includes other drugs such as Mdma, which when you add something else to the Mdma, you get the drug called ecstasy. Mdma is basically it in basically pure form. And marijuana is also included in this category. Marijuana is actually a very interesting drug because what that actually does is it goes in and it basically releases all the neurotransmitters in your body. So, or in your brain rather. So whether it should be in that category versus any other category, really hard to say, and this isn't necessarily my area of expertise. But a lot of places do put it in this category. The hallucinogens are actually commonly used in a lot of religious ceremonies. Not all religions have that, but certainly some of them do. Native Americans were using stuff like this in their ceremonies. And shamans still, of various forms, also use this type of thing too to help with a vision quest. When it's used in religious ceremonies, usually it's called something a little bit different. This entheogen, probably pronouncing it wrong, sorry. I keep trying and I keep misdoing it every single time. Hallucinogens are, they have varying legality in the US. Some of them, morning glory for example, you can quite literally go to Home Depot and buy. I'm not sure what species it is, because it's usually they're apparently not the best quality ones, but you can get it just there. If you really wanted to spend time and make a hallucinogenic tea, you could technically do that. You could also, just, you probably should, if you do choose to do that, please talk to your doctor first and make sure somebody is there to help you just in case. There was, I shadowed psychology of religion before I got my own teaching job, and one of the discussions was this guy sent the professor a thing about what his experience was when he basically did morning glory and turned into a tea. He had this very extensive situation that he had. So, and that was all basically legally purchased morning glory. As we discussed varying legality, right now this is filmed in spring 2021. Marijuana is still got some challenges in being accepted. Some places it's accepted and some places it's not. So be aware of that. But maybe things will be available in the future. Don't really know. But these are at least some of the drugs. There are way more drugs out there than these three categories, but these are three very, very common categories anyway. So you can sit here and quickly look over some of these discussion questions, putting yourself in the position who might have to work at night and how it might affect them differently than working during the day. You can think about that. You could also look at thinking about this whole concept of morning larks and night owls. Which one are you? And how can it affect your ability to function? I am very much a night owl. Teaching at 8 a.m. is probably about the worst thing you can do to me. But I tried to make it work. But I just know that it's going against my normal system. You may also want to look at the questions as to why we stigmatize certain drugs and not others, as far as stimulants or depressants. This is kind of a rhetorical question. I asked this question once to a set of students, and I think somebody's head almost exploded. She was going into healthcare and she just couldn't process. Well, there was a lot of things she couldn't process in this drug section, one of which was that question. So you guys can think about that yourself. You guys also may want to think about why Western civilizations are okay with talking to God, but not with the hallucinogenic drugs. You know, praying is fine, but taking the drugs to have that hallucination is, or whatever, to have a conversation, that's a bad thing. Yet in other cultures, this is how you have that discussion with God. So there's some questions you guys can think about. If there are any questions, you guys can leave a message, drop me an email, or whatever you want to do. And talk to you next time.